In 1963, the steamer Fleurus was burning and sinking with an entire circus menagerie on board, including their cast of dozens of circus animals. The more the fire department fought the flames, the more the ship rolled to its side. This was a race against time to save the animals on board, while also making sure to keep bystanders safe from the deadly beasts. This is the story of one terribly unlucky band of performers, their clunky old ship, and the heroic actions of the locals and the fire department of Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. Right now, I'm walking on the Killam Brothers Wharf, one of several wharfs along the downtown Yarmouth waterfront in Nova Scotia. Now, today the wharf is just like any other wharf and has been heavily modified in the last few decades. But in 1963, it was actually the site of some pretty unique drama. The story begins with the steamer Fleurus, built in 1926 by Atelier et Chantier de la Seine-Maritime in France. She was 195 feet long and had a gross tonnage of 1,122. She was built for the Anticosti Shipping Company for service along the St. Lawrence River from Montreal to Anticosti Island. By the way, I've heard this ship's name pronounced the anglicized way, Fleurus, and also the French way, Fleurus. Since the ship was built in France, I'm gonna stick with my attempt at the French way. The Fleurus was small and nothing fancy, resembling many tramp steamers of the time, but surprisingly she was also equipped with several staterooms, making her a passenger liner as well as a cargo freighter. The passenger accommodations were comfortably appointed, and we can even see some of her early interiors in later photos of the ship being used by the circus performers of 1963. The Firefighter Museum of Nova Scotia has a chair from somewhere on board the Fleurus. It's a relatively ornately designed chair and likely came from either the passenger cabins or officers' quarters. The Fleurus's main passenger service took her sailing from Montreal to the Anticosti Island at the Gulf of the St. Lawrence River. The ship would steam into Port Meunier and then travel around the island, calling on any location where a passenger wished to embark or disembark. As the only proper wharf on the massive island was at Port Meunier, motor launches were stationed around the island to ferry passengers between land and the ship. Anticosti was a rugged island, a paradise for fishermen, campers, backpackers, and explorers, and the Fleurus would deliver them to the island at the start of their adventures and pick them back up when they were done. At the time, the Fleurus was the only regularly scheduled link between the island and the mainland. The original steam engine was replaced by a diesel one in 1950, and 6 years later the ship was sold to the McCormick Shipping Company for service between Miami, Florida, and Cuba, but the ship was laid up and the service discontinued after the Cuban Revolution. In 1963, the ship was sold and refitted as a circus ship, carrying around the Al G. Kelly and Miller Brothers Circus. They made some minor modifications to the vessel, the most notable being repainting the hull a bright orange, their signature color. The Kelly Miller Circus is American-based, but with their new transport ship, they were launching a Canadian tour. Their first performance would be in Digby, Nova Scotia, after which the ship would pack back up and sail south around the coast to Yarmouth. After 2 performances in Yarmouth, it would once more sail southward around the southern tip into Shelbourne, and then Liverpool for more performances, before sailing up to Newfoundland for another seaborne tour. The hype was building around the upcoming Circus circuit. Posters were hung up all around Yarmouth promoting the upcoming 2 performances on June 11th. One of these posters is featured prominently in the gallery of the Firefighters Museum of Nova Scotia, a poster boasting that the circus is the greatest wild animal show in the world. With the first circus performance to be in Digby on June 10th, the Fleurus was loaded up in St. Petersburg, Florida, and set to depart on June 1st, plenty of time for the ship to arrive and set up. But while they were loading up, two mishaps occurred that would delay departure. First, the captain of the Fleurus walked through a glass door, which actually really hurt him. And second, 3 animals, an elephant and 2 ponies, broke loose and had to be tracked down. These setbacks delayed the departure by a day, and now she would depart on June 2nd. Still plenty of time to get to Digby. As the Fleurus was getting underway, the ship's steering machinery broke down, forcing her to return to port. It took 2 full days to fix that machinery, pushing the departure now to June 4th. The ship finally did get away from St. Petersburg, but didn't make it too far. On the second day at sea, it seems everything on the ship broke down all at once. A piston head cracked, disabling the engine so the ship couldn't move. The radio went down so they couldn't call for help, and on top of that, the ship's refrigeration system broke down. So they lost their food, it all spoiled, and that was food for both the people and the animals. The ship drifted helplessly for 6 full days until finally being spotted by a passing airplane, which radioed for help on their behalf. The unfortunate Fleurus was towed back to shore, docking in Charleston, South Carolina for 3 more days while the ship was repaired. Well, June 10th for the Digby performance came and went, and so did June 11th for the Yarmouth performance. A large crowd had gathered on the wharf in Yarmouth to see the circus ship pull in and unload, but the Yarmouth police chief had to break the news to them that there'd be no ship arriving today. The Fleurus was now 2 weeks behind schedule. The Kelly and Miller brothers ended up canceling their Digby performance, but they postponed and rescheduled their 2 Yarmouth performances. They couldn't cancel Yarmouth because it was the Yarmouth Fire Department themselves who had sponsored their trip, so they definitely had to go and put on those shows. The new plan was that the ship would sail straight to Yarmouth from Charleston. The delays only seemed to build the excitement for the people of Yarmouth, and the new day for the performances was scheduled to June 24th. The Fleurus sailed up to the Killam Wharf in downtown Yarmouth, with a massive crowd of spectators excited to see the orange ship packed with wild animals. As the ship pulled up to the wharf, it was noticeably leaning to starboard. All 3 of the circus elephants were stored on that side, and the crew hadn't done anything to trim the vessel out. Either way, it sailed up to the dock without a problem and unloaded. The circus was held at the Western Nova Scotia exhibition grounds. The big top tents were set up, the animals readied, the trapeze artists supplied their makeup, and the crowds gathered outside. Bob Brooks was a local Yarmouth photographer who greeted the ship with his camera when they arrived. He seems to have stuck with the circus from their unloading off of the Fleurus through their performances and then back to their intended departure. It's through his photographs that we're able to almost get to see what these performances were like as if we were there. The first performance was in the afternoon, followed by a larger one in the evening. Both were a huge hit, drawing not only attendance from Yarmouth but from Digby, who had missed the opportunity to see the circus there due to the Fleurus's delays. A popular performance routine at the time was to have an elephant climb up onto a small metal ball and balance there. The ball still exists today, having survived the disaster that was soon about to unfold, and is now on display in the Yarmouth County Museum and Archives. Throughout the night, the circus tent was broken down and the animals packed back up, slowly being carted over from the exhibition grounds and back to the Killam Wharf for loading onto the Fleurus. It was a long night, and the crew had their work cut out for them. The day after the shows were performed, the Yarmouth Herald ran a feature story on the Circus, highlighting how well the show was received, how exciting the ship's arrival was, and how difficult the journey was from Florida to Nova Scotia. The article even mentions how the population of animals grew while the ship was en route to Yarmouth, with a baby llama having been born at sea. To quote the article, "Perhaps the fortunes of the circus have changed since arriving in Yarmouth." However, as that newspaper was printed and the people of Yarmouth were reading about how the fortunes of the Kelly Miller Brothers Circus had improved, their ship was burning and sinking.
I knew the harbor master, I knew him later in life, and he said that the captain was so drunk and he wouldn't take the boat out until the guy sobered up. In the meantime, it was sitting at the wharf. The hay caught on fire from wet hay, ignited, and if they were out to sea, it would have been bad.
The fire broke out early in the afternoon, just as the ship had finished loading and prepared to depart the Killam Wharf. Soon smoke billowed out of the vents to the lower decks, and the ship needed to be hastily evacuated. While getting the people off wasn't the problem, the ship was still tied up to the wharf, and the gangplank still connected them to the dock, so they were able to just walk off no problem. It was the animals, the hundreds of animals still on board, that was the real concern, and most of them were locked up in cages down below. Photographer Bob Brooks, who had already been on hand snapping photographs of the loading of the ship, began capturing shots as the drama slowly unfolded. Additionally, another photographer was standing by taking video. These two sources give us a vivid glimpse at what was to take place. The Yarmouth Fire Department was on site quickly and began running heavy-duty booster hoses down into the ship and into the engine room, at first keeping a safe distance away from the burning vessel. Meanwhile, the animal wranglers and other circus personnel were frantically trying to rescue their beloved friends. Animals were stored in every part of the ship, from cages stacked on the deck to stables down below in the ship's holds, near the fire. The first animals that seemed to have been brought off the ship were a group of white dogs, brought down from the passenger accommodations of the deck house. In the chaos of the evacuation, they needed to be encouraged down the steps, and we could see some of them tumbling. The last dog was frozen in fear, but all dogs escaped onto the wharf unharmed. At the Firefighters Museum of Nova Scotia, among their collection of several beautiful historic firefighting vehicles is this 1933 Chevrolet pumper. It joined the fire department's efforts against the blazing ship, pulling right up to the edge of the wharf to begin its duty pumping water to the hoses.
So at the 1963 fire would be the 1933 Chevy Bickle that was ran by Nade Fire Company in Milton. And then our St. George Fire Company in Southend would have had their 1948 Fargo. That was a custom Fargo fire truck with a LaFrance front mount pump. So it would have had a big fire pump that would have come out of the fire engine. That would have been the second apparatus there. The third on scene, which there are some of the famous shots we have of the Circus ship fire, would be Yarmouth's 1954 Seagrave. So that would have been the most powerful fire engine to have arrived in town to that point.
More fire trucks were on site now, and firefighters began spraying the water down the smoking exhaust vents to the engine room spaces, hoping to smother the fire down below. The scene was described as utter chaos, with fire alarm bells ringing, the loud spray of fire hoses blasting, the groaning of the listing ship. Slowly, animals were being brought off the ship and onto the wharf. Yarmouth's veterinarian, Dr. Hawkes, was on hand to help any animals that might have been hurt, and to help shepherd them away from the burning ship to safety. This leopard was overly frightened and might even have been hurt in the evacuation, and Dr. Hawkes helped nurse it back to health. All of the fire hoses spraying into the Fleurus, combined with the initial list to starboard, now caused open portholes in the hull to submerge, and the ship was sinking uncontrollably. It was already past the point of no return now, but the lowering of the ship combined with the list did offer one advantage. The deck was now perfectly level with the wharf, and the workers nearby were able to lay strong wooden boards across the gap. Using the boards as a bridge, the elephants were quickly ushered off the ship, along with any other large animal that was accessible. Dr. Hawkes boarded the sinking ship several times to help remove the animals, even going below deck to help free the circus's horses with the other workers. One of them, a white horse named Sparkle, had its hoof stuck between boards. The angle of the ship added further pressure, and it was nearly impossible to get Sparkle free. The water was rising fast. The ship was listing further and settling deeper and deeper, and yet the smoke continued to billow out of the exhaust vents. Meanwhile, a large crowd had gathered on the wharf and streets nearby.
In 1963, the building extended out several dozen feet in that direction. So what you're seeing right now is only a fraction of what was there. In fact, in some of the old photographs, we can see just how big that building was.
There were still cages covering the ship's decks containing large, dangerous animals. Well, they couldn't simply be released for fear of them attacking someone in the spectating crowd. The only option was to hoist the cages off the ship, but the power was dead on board, and with the increasing list, Fleurus's cargo cranes were completely disabled.
At the time of the fire, the Canadian government was actually building a new government wharf, which you can see right over there, just to the south. So they had a large crane on the site for that construction. And with all of these animal cages on board the flaming ship, they decided it would be smart to get that crane over to this wharf as quickly as possible to start hauling off some of those cages.
Well, the crane idea worked, and the cages of deadly animals were one by one hoisted up. As an added precaution, however, the fire chief asked his men and other civilians to get rifles and stand by. Well, there was the obvious reason. If one of these animals broke free and charged at a person, the animal would need to be put down. But the idea was also that if the ship were to suddenly give way before some of the cages could be removed, these men would put the animals out of their misery rather than let them go down trapped.
So in the public, commonly we perceive firefighting as just hoses on fire, but this is probably one of the best examples that we can demonstrate of arriving at a crazy situation. So you have to picture firefighters climbing aboard a vessel to help operate cranes to get wild animals off a ship while they're actually trying to put out the fire at the same time.
Bears were removed, and now it was time for the lions, the deadliest animals on the ship. And wouldn't you know it, just as the cage was airborne, the sling that was supporting it snapped, and the cage swung dangerously through the air. At any moment, it might fall and break open. Well, the poor lions inside were terrified, and the marksmen were nervously ready. But the line held, and the cage was lowered onto the wharf safely. It's often joked that we don't know who was more rattled, the firefighters or the lions.
Well, there was a buzz around town, you know. I was up on Main Street and everybody was saying there's something going on the waterfront. So, you know, being a small kid, you ride your bicycle down there, and I saw mainly horses. They had a lot of cages at that time sitting on the wharf. There were lions and wild dogs, they called them, and a variety of animals. And I heard a young man talking on the phone. He said, I'm in a small town called Nova Scotia.
Meanwhile, though, the ship is going down. Sparkle's hoof was still wedged, and water was pouring into the smoke-filled stables on the lower decks. The water poured up over the main deck and began flooding down, the ship dropping rapidly into the water. There were still a couple of other animals in addition to Sparkle on board, a zebra and a Brahma bull. As everything shifted when the ship rolled, whatever had Sparkle's hoof wedged in place moved, and Sparkle, along with the bull, was able to swim up and out the ship's cargo hatch as the Fleurus settled. The bull was pulled from the water, but Sparkle, in panic, swam under the wharf, flailing and screaming. Bob Dawson, one of the circus workers, heard Sparkle's screams, and without hesitation leapt from the wharf and into the water. It was dark and cramped under the wharf, but Bob swam in after the dangerously frightened animal. Calmly, he swam over to Sparkle, soothing it and talking to it, until Sparkle was calm enough to be led out from under the wharf and up onto shore.
And the old man, maybe like in his 70s, he looked like an old sailor crying because, the horse that he took care of had been injured. It seemed like just superficial wounds. And he was saying, you can't put a horse like that down. You can't.
The zebra ended up being the only casualty in the fire and sinking of the SS Fleurus. Sad as that is for the zebra, it's absolutely incredible that the circus workers, the Yarmouth Fire Department, Dr. Hawks, and the locals were able to almost fully evacuate a burning, sinking ship with no other loss of life. A testament to the courage and masterful coordination of all who responded to the alarm. Locals who owned fields and pastures allowed the circus to park their cages on their property and to allow some of the animals to get out and graze, while the circus tried to figure out what to do next.
The elephant was there, and being a 12-year-old kid, I thought I'd go over and give the elephant some grass. And he took his trunk and he wrapped it around the back of me, and I thought that was great. I thought he was going to pick me up and put him on the back. And all of a sudden I hear this, "Boydie, get away from him." And I looked over, and there was my father, who I thought was so brave. He was a little nervous around that elephant. There was a tiny little horse that was only 18 inches high, I think, and I went over to pet him, and just he went and kicked me that fast. Boom, boom. So I thought, maybe not play with that horse.
The Kelly and Miller Brothers Circus, having lost so many of their material items, including their big top circus tent, as well as all of their morale, decided to pack up and return to the United States by road. So the circus tour was canceled. That wasn't the end of their troubles, though. At one point, one of the trucks crashed, killing one of their workers. The Fleurus sat swamped at the foot of the Killam Wharf for a couple of weeks, blocking marine traffic and leaking diesel fuel into the sea.
And I've got a little momentum myself from it. I've got two deep scars about that wide going up my leg. We were playing in one of the lifeboats. They were not really lifeboats, rafts. And we had to make paddles. And when my friend threw me in the water, there were nails sticking out, and I cut my leg.
The location of the fire is not too far from the dock for the ferry that would take someone from Yarmouth to Bar Harbor, Maine. So if you're actually one of the many tourists every year that come in on the ferry, you were very close to where this fire broke out.
The Partridge Motorboat Service of Halifax was contracted to raise and remove the sunken vessel, and they got to work employing divers to seal up the holds underwater.
The two divers, Vince Patcherson and Curly Them, they're down there working away. Pat was in side, and all the hay fell in. But these guys were close. They were divers. And as soon as he saw that, they both started digging until they met and came out.
When everything was patched up, air pumps forced the water out of the holds, slowly making the ship more and more buoyant. The stern released first, followed by the bow. Although the ship had a serious list once it was refloated, the Fleurus was towed north, up deeper into the Yarmouth harbor so that it would be out of the way of incoming traffic from the south, and grounded.
So it's somewhere around here that the Fleurus was sunk the second time.
It seems that over time the ship was scrapped and disappeared. While that's the end of the story for the old SS Fleurus, it's not the end of the story for the animals in the Kelly and Miller Brothers Circus. The circus had 3 elephants in it, but it's unclear what happened to 2 of them, with some sources saying that they were killed in a truck accident, perhaps the one while the circus was returning from Canada. But the 3rd elephant, a female named Shirley, gained fame in recent years. She was eventually retired from circuses, after which she was put into a zoo, ultimately retiring altogether to the Tennessee Elephant Sanctuary. She was the subject of a popular documentary for PBS celebrating her final years, which would be lived out in peace at the sanctuary. A happy ending to a difficult life. Do you remember that newspaper article in the Yarmouth Herald that I previously mentioned? The one that ironically talked about the fortunes turning around for the circus from now on? It also spent some time talking about circuses coming to Yarmouth by ship in the past. While in 1963 a circus ship was certainly a novelty, it actually wasn't the first time one came to Yarmouth by ship. 127 years prior, in 1836, a steamer called the Royal Tar brought a circus to Yarmouth as well. Royal Tar was based out of St. John, New Brunswick, just across the Bay of Fundy from Yarmouth, and less than a year after its launch, the Royal Tar was transporting a circus and menagerie down to Maine for an international performance. The circus had a catchy name in my opinion: Dexter's Locomotive Museum and Burgess's Collection of Serpents and Birds. That was it. To fit the large circus animals on board, several lifeboats had to be removed. While sailing to Maine in a storm, the boiler overheated and caught fire. One lifeboat was stolen by a mutinous crew, leaving only one for everyone else. The captain oversaw the construction of rafts, but they were destroyed by a stampeding elephant. The Royal Tar sank, killing 32 of the 93 people on board and most, but not all, of the animals. When I researched circus ship fires, it's funny that these are the only 2 that I could find, period. And yet, they both happened right around Yarmouth, Nova Scotia. A big thank you to the Firefighters Museum of Nova Scotia for their help on this project, letting us see the equipment involved in the disaster as well as their collection of artifacts.
We hope you join us at the Firefighters Museum of Nova Scotia, probably the 2nd to 3rd largest collection of hand-pumped fire engines in North America, taking us back to the earliest days of firefighting. It's also one of the only spots where you'll see 3 steam fire engines, not just one, from 3 different makers, both Canadian and American, that served in Canada. And then it branches out from there. If you're a fire buff, we can show you almost every decade of the early 20th century in the form of apparatus, and it branches out from there into artwork, stories, pictures, and other artifacts. This building was built in 1915, the Firefighters Museum of Nova Scotia. Later in the building's life, it served as a motor mart garage, and it's really fascinating. As you can see, one of the wreckers or tow trucks with the winches that was used to do some of the rescue and removing the cages from the ship is an actual motor mart vehicle that would have been based in this building in '63 before we were the Firefighters Museum. Just a really neat connection that brings the story back to where some of the fire engines ended up in our museum from the circus ship fire. We're located right on Main Street in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia at 451, and parking lot is just to the left of the building, right on Main.
I want to also thank the Yarmouth County Archives for providing so many outstanding visuals for this documentary. Be sure to visit both museums should you ever find yourself in Yarmouth. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more content like this. Consider joining my YouTube channel memberships or Patreon at the link in the description below. A special thank you to my supporters on Patreon, especially Marlo Perez, Kelly Black, Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Friedrich III, Zach Richards, Donald Anderson, Cody Henricks, Joan Haynes, Sean Kimball, Glenn Biddiscombe, Stephen Schwankertz, Gabriel Colomb, RGB, Tara Molokar, Keith Holland, Rob M., Amos Mayhew, Corey Andrews, Nicholas Masella, Cole Tannick, Sophie Baber, Rob, Oliver Chin-Chen, John Maluski, David Watipka, Tiffany Raridan, Mad Time Media, Nathan Gutierrez, Max Metcalf, David Littlejohn, Sean Sahi Frazier, Nikki Chan 92, Corbin McDonald, Matthew Burns, Goblin of the Salt Plains, Luke Stevens, Gordon Robbins, Aaron Stark, Troy Wentworth, Clarky, Sam Forker, Busy Bee, Christopher Rosendale, Road Weary, Kitty Bits, Taniel 38, Kenzo Buick, Brian Reedy, Eden Cleefish, Bless Mulls, Coda Yoda 16, Carol Adams, Clay Hobbs, Steve Valley, Gojira's Trains, J.C. Hobbs, and High Treason.